At 2 a.m., I heard the unmistakable sound of a shovel scraping the earth outside my window. My heart dropped. Caleb, my own grandson, was digging in my yard in the dead of night. I watched, frozen, as he muttered to himself, desperate. But I did nothing. Not yet. The next morning, I dug too. What I found buried beneath the soil would unravel everything he had tried to take from me, and it would send him straight to court. All right. Before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The sound was low at first, a faint scraping that might have been mistaken for the wind shifting the old oak tree's branches. But Eleanor knew better. Her eyes snapped open, heart suddenly thumping in her chest. It was 2 a.m. The house, usually so quiet at this hour, felt alive with the noise. She lay still in the dark, the soft rustle of her breath mingling with the sound outside her window. The scraping was louder now, more frantic. It wasn't the wind. Someone was digging. The thought rushed through her like a jolt of electricity. Caleb. Eleanor slid out of bed, the sheets rustling as she moved, careful not to make a sound. She tiptoed to the window, pressing her hand to the cool glass. Her pulse beat louder than the scraping noise, and for a moment, the world outside her window seemed frozen. There, under the gnarled oak tree in the backyard, stood Caleb. She sucked in a sharp breath, her heart skipping. His figure was a shadow against the night, outlined faintly by the weak moonlight that filtered through the leaves. He was digging. Shovel in hand, his movements were steady but urgent. The metal clinked against something hard in the soil, and Caleb muttered to himself in that low, tense voice of his. It's gotta be here. Her stomach twisted, and a cold chill ran through her. What was he looking for? Why at this hour? The questions flooded her mind, but she didn't move, didn't dare breathe too loudly. Eleanor's hands pressed against the window frame, nails digging into the wood as she steadied herself. Caleb had always been unpredictable, but tonight felt different. There was a desperation in his movements, a need that stretched through the air between them, even though they were separated by yards of earth and grass. The scraping continued, the rhythm steady and relentless. Each shovelful of dirt that landed with a soft thud seemed to echo in her ears, and her own breath felt too loud in the silence of the house. She should have called out to him, told him to stop. But a part of her, something deep in her gut, held her back. Something felt wrong. She couldn't place it. But there was something else. She wasn't scared of Caleb. She had lived with him long enough to know his moods, his tricks. No, this fear wasn't of him. It was of what he was doing, what he might find. She pulled away from the window, her heart pounding in her chest as she stumbled back a step. Her mind raced, but her body felt slow, heavy with indecision. She could confront him now, march out there, and demand to know what he was up to. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the uncertainty in the air, the feeling that whatever Caleb was after, she wouldn't be ready to face it yet. Number. She would wait. She needed to understand, to see the truth with her own eyes. She was tired of feeling like the last to know, tired of the secrets that always seemed to swirl around Caleb. Her breath shallow, she sank back into bed, pulling the covers over her with trembling hands. The scraping continued outside, a reminder that something was unfolding just beyond her reach. But she didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed. The scraping slowed, then stopped altogether. Eleanor's eyes snapped open. Had he gone? She waited, listening for any sound, but there was nothing but the hum of the house settling into the night. Finally, as the first light of dawn broke through the curtains, she rose from the bed, her movements slow and deliberate. The house was eerily quiet now, the night's tension still hanging in the air like a heavy fog. She made her way down the stairs, her feet light on the old wood floors, and moved to the back door. The yard outside was bathed in soft early morning light, the oak tree casting long shadows across the grass. Caleb was gone, but something was off. The earth by the tree was disturbed, fresh dirt scattered around the hole he had dug. Eleanor knelt down, her fingers brushing against the cool, damp soil. Her breath hitched when her hand brushed against something solid, metal. She dug deeper, her heart in her throat, the faintest tremor in her hands. And there it was, a rusted strongbox. Her fingers traced the edges of it, and for a moment, the world around her seemed to freeze. The truth lay beneath her fingertips, buried in the earth for who knows how long. But why would Caleb be digging for this? What had he been searching for? She pulled the box from the ground, the heavy metal scraping against the dirt. Her mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't open it here, not now. Not with so many questions lingering unanswered. But whatever was inside, whatever Caleb had hoped to find, was no longer buried. It was out in the open, and she had no idea just how deep the lies went. Eleanor sat in the dimly lit kitchen, the rusted strongbox resting in front of her on the old wooden table. The house, now bathed in the quiet glow of early morning, felt still. The air was thick with unanswered questions. Outside, the faint echo of the oak tree's leaves in the wind was the only sound. Caleb's hurried digging, his desperation, felt like a distant memory. But the weight of the box in front of her was very real. Her hands shook as she pried open the box. The metal groaned in protest, a long, painful screech that made her skin prickle. Inside, there was nothing extraordinary at first. Glance. Yellowed papers stacked neatly, secured with old rubber bands. Eleanor hesitated, her breath shallow, her gut twisted with every moment she delayed. There was no turning back now. She pulled the first paper from the pile, the edges brittle and frail beneath her fingers. The ink was faded, but still legible. The names, the dates, the numbers, they seemed to blur into each other. And then she saw it. Caleb's name, written clearly at the top of a loan agreement. But it wasn't an inheritance document, as she had half expected. It was a promissory note, a loan, forged in her late husband's name. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She flipped through the pages quickly now, one after another, each revealing the same damning truth. More loans, more signatures, none of them her husband's. All forged, all in Caleb's name. The amounts were staggering, each one larger than the last. Caleb hadn't been trying to inherit anything. He had been borrowing money, huge sums, and using her husband's identity to cover his debts. Her throat tightened. It was too much, too dark. The man she had helped raise, her own grandson, had done this, and he had done it in secret, under her nose. Eleanor sat back, blinking rapidly, trying to hold onto the ground beneath her. The room felt suddenly too small, too suffocating. Lydia entered the kitchen, her soft footsteps barely audible on the creaking floorboards. She stopped at the sight of Eleanor's pale face, the open box between her hands. Lydia's eyes flickered to the papers scattered around, her expression shifting from curiosity to something darker. She stepped closer, then froze. "Grandma, what is this?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost afraid. Eleanor couldn't answer at first. She stared at the pages in front of her, then back at Lydia, her mind spinning with all the things she wanted to say. Her chest tightened. It wasn't just the shock of the moment. It was the crushing realization that everything Caleb had done was now exposed. His lies, his deception, all of it was right here, in her hands. Lydia bent down, picking up one of the papers, her eyes scanning it quickly. She sucked in a breath, then turned to Eleanor, her face going pale. "Grandma, this is criminal." The words hung heavy in the air. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. Her throat was dry, and the weight of the discovery pressed down on her like an anchor. Caleb had crossed a line that no family could come back from. But the truth was, she hadn't been ready for this. Not this. Lydia was already on her phone, dialing a number with trembling fingers. She held the phone to her ear as she paced the kitchen, her eyes darting between Eleanor and the papers. Eleanor watched her, the image of her granddaughter's nervous energy striking something deep inside her. Lydia was trying to reach someone for help, someone who could understand this. Clara White, Lydia said after a moment, her voice tight. We need her now. This isn't just about the house anymore. It's fraud. Caleb's forged grandpa's name. Eleanor didn't speak, but she didn't need to. She could hear the panic in Lydia's voice, and she knew it was real. The phone call didn't take long. Clara White, their attorney, was on her way over. When the doorbell rang a short time later, Eleanor was already seated at the table, the papers spread out before her. Clara's expression changed the moment she stepped into the kitchen. Her sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in the box, the papers, and the two women standing there, clearly in shock. Clara's gaze landed on the papers as she sat down, her hands steady as she picked up one of the forged loan agreements. She didn't need to read much before her face tightened. This isn't inheritance, Clara said, her voice low but steady, her eyes flickering between the papers and Eleanor. It's fraud. Caleb is deep in this, and you're going to need more than a lawyer. This could ruin him. Eleanor's hands clenched around the edge of the table, her nails digging into the wood. I want him stopped, she said, her voice breaking the silence, cold and final. I want him to face the truth. Clara met her gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. We'll get this out in the open. But you need to be prepared. This could go much deeper than you think. Eleanor's heart thudded in her chest. She had just uncovered the first layer of Caleb's deception, but as the truth settled over her, Eleanor knew one thing for sure. The worst was yet to come. The knock on the door came like a sudden crack of thunder, loud and uninvited. Eleanor didn't flinch. She had known it was coming. She could feel it in the tension that had been building inside the walls of her home, the quiet that felt too still. She set her coffee mug down carefully, the china clicking softly against the table. The taste of bitterness lingered on her tongue as she rose slowly, each step measured and calm. Lydia was already moving toward the door, her body tight with anticipation, but Eleanor placed a hand gently on her shoulder, stopping her. Let me handle this, Eleanor murmured, her voice steady, though the storm inside her raged. She reached the door and opened it. Caleb stood there, his face flushed with impatience, his eyes hard and cold. He stepped forward before she had a chance to say anything, barging into the room as if it were his own. Sign the house over, he demanded, his voice sharp, laced with authority. Eleanor didn't say a word. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable as he stepped into the kitchen, the air between them charged with something dangerous. Behind him, Marla stood, her face pinched with the same sense of entitlement that Caleb wore like armor. You're old, Marla added, as if it were the simplest fact of the world. Let him take responsibility. He's the one who's been dealing with everything. This place, these bills. You don't need it anymore. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the back of the chair as she moved back to the table, her body tense with control. Caleb's eyes tracked her every movement, as if waiting for her to crumble under the weight of his words. But Eleanor wasn't crumbling. She wouldn't. With deliberate slowness, she lifted her coffee mug again, taking a long sip, never breaking eye contact with Caleb. The heat of the drink was soothing against the cold storm in her chest, but the bitterness didn't escape her. She could taste it in the back of her throat, the sourness of betrayal that had been slowly creeping into her life, now fully exposed. Why don't you sit down, Caleb? Eleanor's voice was a calm ripple across the tension that had thickened in the room. She set the cup down with a soft clink. You're asking for something that isn't yours. Caleb's face twisted into something that wasn't quite anger, but something darker. You don't have a choice. Just sign the papers, and we'll be done. His voice dropped lower, a warning, a threat hanging in the words. Marla nodded behind him. It's for the best, Eleanor. You've been forgetful. Caleb's the one who'll make sure everything's taken care of. Lydia, standing near the corner of the room, shifted slightly, her phone subtly in her hand. Her thumb hovered over the screen, recording the exchange without either of them noticing. Her eyes flicked to Eleanor, who gave the faintest nod, a silent confirmation. Caleb's expression hardened, but he didn't notice Lydia's movements. Sign it, he repeated, impatience boiling in his voice. I'm tired of waiting. The house. The money. It's mine now. Eleanor's gaze didn't falter. She took another sip of coffee, the warmth spreading through her, grounding her, even as the storm raged just beyond her walls. I told you, she said softly, her voice steady and controlled. You're not getting a damn thing from me. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Marla's lips tightened into a thin line, her eyes darting between Caleb and Eleanor. Caleb took a step forward, as if his proximity could force her to bend to his will. You're making a mistake, Grandma, he spat, his voice laced with venom. You'll regret this. But Eleanor only watched him. She had seen this side of Caleb before, the way he could twist a conversation, the way he could manipulate, demand, guilt. But this time, it wasn't working. Outside, a low rumble of voices broke through the tense air. Eleanor's gaze flicked to the window. Through the glass, she saw two men leaning against Caleb's car, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes flickering nervously around the yard. The way they stood, shoulders hunched, glancing over their shoulders, made something inside her stomach twist. Lydia caught her gaze, a frown creeping onto her face. She must have seen it too. Frank, the neighbor, had wandered out onto his porch, his usual post for watching the world go by. He must have noticed the men near Caleb's car. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat as she realized what this was. Debt collectors. Caleb's game had gone further than just his family. Her gaze slid back to Caleb. You're not going to intimidate me, Caleb. She stood straighter now, feeling the weight of the evidence hidden in her drawers, the promise of the truth that would tear everything apart. If you want war, we'll fight with paper. Caleb sneered at her words, but Eleanor's resolve was unshakable. She'd lived through worse than him, and she wasn't about to give in to his threats. Lydia's phone buzzed with a message and her fingers moved quickly to type a response. Eleanor knew her granddaughter was contacting Clara, gathering the resources she would need to protect them from whatever Caleb planned next. The front door opened and Frank's voice rang through the house. Everything all right in there, Eleanor? He called, his tone casual but sharp with concern. Eleanor's lips curled into a small, tight smile. I think Caleb and I are about to have a very long discussion, Frank. Caleb glared at her one last time, his jaw clenched. He looked at Marla, who only nodded stiffly. They turned toward the door, but not before Caleb hissed, "This isn't over." As the door slammed behind them, Eleanor allowed herself one last breath. The real fight was just beginning, and she was ready for it. The courthouse felt colder than it should have, the sterile air pressing against Eleanor's chest, making each breath feel too shallow. It had been days since Caleb's outburst, since his last attempt to break her, but the echoes of his words lingered in her mind. You're making a mistake, Grandma. You'll regret this. But Eleanor wouldn't regret it. Not now. Not when she was standing at the threshold of something bigger. The weight of her decision sat heavy on her, a burden she would carry into this courtroom. But she didn't back down. Not for Caleb. Not for anyone. Her heels clicked on the marble floor as she made her way toward the witness stand, her hand steady on Lydia's arm as they moved together, side by side. Lydia had insisted on coming. She had insisted on being here for Eleanor. The bond between them had never been clearer, never been more vital. Eleanor had spent years protecting Lydia from the world, and now Lydia would be here to protect her. As they entered the courtroom, Caleb's presence struck her immediately, his sharp eyes glaring from the back row. He looked different today, his expression tight, controlled. He had been waiting for this, but Eleanor had already made her choice. Clara, seated beside Eleanor, leaned in slightly, her voice a calm murmur. We're ready, Eleanor, but you need to prepare yourself. The petition he's filed claims you're unfit, that you're losing control of your faculties. He's going to try to paint you as forgetful. Confused. Eleanor nodded, her throat tightening, but she didn't speak. Not yet. She would not give Caleb that power, not in this place, not in front of everyone. She had prepared herself for this, For the lies he would spin, the venomous accusations, she would let him speak first. Let him set the stage. Lydia sat down next to her hand gripping Eleanor's. The quiet reassurance was all the strength Eleanor needed. In the corner of her vision, she saw Frank slip into the courtroom, taking a seat a few rows behind them. He nodded at her, the small gesture a quiet promise of support. The gavel struck, and the proceedings began. Caleb's attorney stood first, filing the petition with practiced ease. He spoke with a calm, rehearsed tone, painting a picture of Eleanor as a woman on the brink of losing control of her own life. "She's becoming forgetful," the attorney said, his eyes scanning the room, unable to care for herself. "She's no longer capable of making sound decisions regarding her affairs." Caleb leaned forward in his seat, his gaze fixed on Eleanor, a quiet smirk curling on his lips. His mother, Marla, sat beside him, her face impassive, though there was a flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. She was complicit in this. She always had been. Eleanor's pulse quickened, but she didn't look away from Caleb. She didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her doubt. It was time to stand her ground. Clara stood next, her sharp voice cutting through the air as she countered Caleb's claims. "This is a fabricated attack, designed to undermine my client's mental and emotional state. Eleanor Turner is of sound mind. This petition is a thinly veiled attempt at taking control of her estate." But Caleb wasn't finished. He had prepared his own arsenal. Marla, her expression painted with feigned concern, rose to testify. Her voice trembled with practiced distress as she spoke. "Eleanor's been slipping," Marla said, her words laced with the weight of someone pretending to care. "She forgets things. She's misplacing documents. We've tried to help her, but—" She paused, glancing briefly at Caleb before continuing. "She just doesn't seem to understand anymore. She's losing control." Eleanor's blood simmered beneath her skin, but she kept her expression steady. The only thing she would lose control of today was the court. Lydia's voice broke through her thoughts as she whispered, "I'll testify. I'll tell the truth about everything." Eleanor squeezed her hand, grateful but sad for what Lydia had to witness. This wasn't the life she should have been thrust into. Frank rose from his seat, his weathered face steady, his voice calm as he addressed the court. "I've known Eleanor for years. I'm her neighbor. I've seen the truth. Caleb's accusations are false. She hasn't lost anything. If anything, it's Caleb who's been losing control, trying to take what doesn't belong to him." Eleanor's heart swelled at the sight of Frank, her ally in all of this, a man who had seen the truth, who would not bend to Caleb's manipulation. It wasn't just the family that was watching. It was the community, too. They knew her. They would help her. The room fell silent as Clara gathered the papers. She handed a document to the judge, who examined it briefly before looking up, his face inscrutable. The weight of the decision that would come next pressed on everyone in the room. Eleanor couldn't breathe. The judge paused, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment she thought he saw everything, the pain, the betrayal, the resolve. But then he spoke, and the words came like an echo through her chest. "We'll reconvene tomorrow. It's clear there's much to consider, but the facts will guide us." Eleanor stood as the gavel struck, the room emptying out around her, but the weight of this moment pressed against her like a heavy fog. Caleb hadn't won yet, but the fight was far from over. She walked out of the courtroom, her heart racing with both fear and defiance. They were still coming for her home, her life, her legacy. But Eleanor was ready. The real battle had just begun. The courtroom hummed with a quiet tension as the second day of the hearing began. Eleanor's hands were steady on the witness stand, but her heart was anything but calm. Across the room, Caleb sat, a smug expression plastered across his face. His eyes, sharp and unblinking, never left her, as if daring her to flinch. Beside him, Marla whispered low, her voice indistinguishable from the rustling of papers, but Eleanor knew exactly what they were saying. This wasn't about family anymore. This was a war. The gavel struck, and the judge's voice cut through the low murmur of the room. "Let's proceed." Miss Turner, you may take the stand. Eleanor took a deep breath and stood, her legs steady beneath her as she walked to the witness box. She kept her head high, her gaze unwavering. This was the moment she had prepared for, the moment she would not allow Caleb to control. She knew the lies he had spun. She knew the way he had tried to paint her as someone incapable of understanding, someone who had lost the ability to manage her own life. But it was time to turn the tables. As she sat down in the witness chair, the weight of the room pressed in on her. She could feel the eyes of everyone, Caleb, Marla, the judge, the jury, fixed on her, waiting for her to crumble. But she wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. The judge nodded to her. Miss Turner, please tell the court your version of events. Eleanor's voice was calm, clear. I am not senile, Your Honor, she began, each word deliberate, each syllable measured. I am not losing control of my faculties, as my grandson and his mother have claimed. I am fully aware of what is happening here, and I have been for some time. Her eyes flicked briefly to Caleb, whose smug grin faltered for a fraction of a second. The house you're trying to take from me, the money you believe is yours. It doesn't belong to you, Caleb, and I've never forgotten that. The judge nodded, taking notes as Eleanor continued, dismantling Caleb's claims piece by piece. Her voice never wavered. Every word was a weapon, every statement a shield. She described the evidence she had uncovered, the lies Caleb had told, the way he had forged her late husband's name. The room hung on her every word, and even Caleb seemed to shrink in his seat, his arrogance slowly seeping out of him. Clara stood next, moving with purpose, a folder of documents in hand. She presented the original deed, the one that Caleb had tried to steal, the one that proved Eleanor's ownership. This deed is authentic, Clara said, laying it flat on the table for the judge's inspection. It was signed by Eleanor's late husband, and it is legally binding. But then, just as the momentum seemed to be shifting in Eleanor's favor, Lydia shifted in her seat, her phone in hand. She made sure the sound was off, that the recording was clear. When the moment was right, she pressed play. The room went silent as Caleb's voice filled the space, his words from the night he had tried to force Eleanor into signing over her house. You don't have a choice, Grandma. If you don't sign, I'll make sure you lose everything. I'll ruin you. Lydia's voice echoed in the quiet of the room. I have the full recording, Your Honor. Caleb threatened her. He tried to intimidate her into giving him control of the house. That's not just a family disagreement. It's a crime. Eleanor's breath caught in her chest as the courtroom shifted, gasps rippling through the crowd. Caleb's face paled for the briefest moment before his mask of confidence slipped back into place. His eyes flicked to his mother, who was already looking away, pretending not to notice. But they knew. The truth had been exposed. The judge's eyes narrowed at Caleb, his irritation now visible. Mr. Turner, he said, his voice low but firm, you're walking a very thin line here. This is not a game. You've heard the evidence. Now, you'll have to account for your actions. But Caleb wasn't done. His smirk returned, this time colder, sharper. He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a set of papers, and handed them to the judge with a flourish. Your Honor, Caleb said, his voice dripping with false confidence. I have new papers. Evidence that proves my claim. The judge took the papers and examined them carefully, his brow furrowing as he read the document. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Something wasn't right. Finally, the judge looked up, his expression a mixture of confusion and suspicion. This document, he began slowly, appears to be a deed. A deed that names you, Mr. Turner, as co-owner of the property. The words landed like a blow. Eleanor's stomach dropped, her throat closing as she stared at the papers. This couldn't be happening. Caleb had forged another document, this one with his name included as co-owner. Lydia gasped beside her, her hand tightening around Eleanor's. That's a lie, she whispered, her voice tight with disbelief. Eleanor's mind raced. She had seen Caleb's determination before, but this was something new. He was prepared for this. He had planned this all along. The house, the money, the legacy. It wasn't just about taking what wasn't his anymore. It was about rewriting history. The judge held up the forged deed, his voice cutting through the thickening silence. This will need to be examined further. Mr. Turner, this document looks suspicious. If it is proven to be fraudulent, the consequences will be severe. Caleb's smirk never wavered as he leaned back in his seat, his eyes gleaming with something darker than triumph. He wasn't done yet, and neither was Eleanor. But now, more than ever, she knew. This fight was about to get much, much worse. The courtroom had fallen into a tense silence, thick with disbelief. Caleb sat back, a smug expression plastered on his face, his fingers drumming on the papers in front of him. He had done it. He had produced a forged deed, one that supposedly named him as co-owner of the property. His eyes gleamed with victory, his breath shallow with anticipation. The room watched in stunned silence, waiting for the next move, but Caleb's confidence was palpable, like a wall he was building around himself. Eleanor felt the air in the room tighten around her, the weight of this new development pressing in on her chest. Her hands were steady on the armrests of the witness chair, but inside, her heart was pounding. She had known Caleb would fight dirty. This, however, was a new low. The judge's voice sliced through the room. "Mr. Turner, you are claiming ownership of this property, but I am not convinced that this deed is legitimate. We will need to verify its authenticity." Clara's face, ever composed, sharpened with a quiet fury. She stood and moved toward the judge's bench, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. She was calm, but there was fire in her eyes. "Your Honor," she said, her voice cutting through the tension, "this document requires further investigation. It reeks of manipulation and deceit. I demand a handwriting analysis." The judge looked up, his eyes narrowing at Caleb, his expression hardening with each passing moment. "I agree," he said firmly. "We will conduct a forensic examination immediately. If this deed is forged, there will be consequences." "You've been warned, Mr. Turner." Caleb's smirk faltered, just for a moment, but he quickly regained control, pushing his shoulders back and sitting straighter in his chair. "This is all a misunderstanding," he muttered, his voice more defensive than before. Clara didn't give him the chance to elaborate. "There is no misunderstanding, Mr. Turner. You are attempting to steal what is not yours, and we will prove it." The judge turned to the bailiff. "Arrange for a forensic handwriting analysis, and ensure it is done with urgency. I expect the results by tomorrow." Caleb's expression shifted from one of bravado to panic. His jaw clenched, and his eyes flickered nervously as the weight of his actions seemed to catch up with him. The air in the courtroom crackled with the tension of a man who knew his lies were unraveling. Marla, who had been silent until now, stood quickly, her face flushed with something between disbelief and frustration. "This is absurd," she cried, her voice high-pitched and trembling. "My son is not a criminal. He's misunderstood. This whole thing is a misunderstanding." The judge's gaze snapped to Marla, his voice cold. "I suggest you sit down, Mrs. Turner. Your son's actions are what we are concerned with here, not your accusations." Eleanor remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, her expression unreadable. She was silent, her mind whirling with a mix of emotions: anger, relief, and something else, something deeper. She had known Caleb for years. She had seen his temper, his manipulations, but this was something different. He had crossed a line, and there was no coming back from this. Her thoughts were interrupted by the soft click of Clara's shoes as she moved back to her seat. Clara's eyes met Eleanor's, her expression one of quiet satisfaction. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a turning point. For the first time in this entire case, Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. Caleb, meanwhile, was sinking deeper into his seat, his fingers twitching, his gaze darting from the judge to his mother, and then back to the papers in front of him. He had been so sure, so confident that this forged deed would secure his victory. But now, the room was no longer on his side. The lies were unraveling before him. Mr. Turner. The judge's voice interrupted the growing silence. We will conduct a full investigation into this deed. If it proves to be fraudulent, as I suspect, you will be held accountable for your actions. You are skating on dangerous ground. Caleb didn't respond. He sat back, his eyes glued to the table, his knuckles white as they clenched around the papers in his hands. Marla, looking more and more like a woman grasping at straws, glanced at her son, but said nothing more. She had no more excuses to offer. The evidence was clear. Eleanor's mind raced, but she kept her expression still. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Caleb was dangerous, and this was only the beginning. But for the first time in what felt like forever, she felt the weight of the truth on her side. It wasn't just about fighting him anymore. It was about exposing the full extent of his deceit. She watched Caleb's panic grow, and for a moment she allowed herself to savor the silence. The tables had turned, but she knew this fight wasn't over yet. And tomorrow, when the results of the forensic analysis came in, it would all come crashing down. Caleb's game was up. The courtroom had settled into an almost unbearable silence, the kind that presses on your chest and makes each breath feel too loud. Eleanor sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes steady on Caleb. He was still the same, a man who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. But now, things were different. Now, he was cornered. The gavel struck sharply, and the judge's voice sliced through the tension. We will reconvene tomorrow with the forensic analysis results. Until then, I expect no further surprises. Caleb's gaze flickered toward the door, a sharp, calculating glance, but he didn't speak. His mind was already elsewhere, already scheming his next move. Marla sat beside him, her face pale, her hands clutching the armrests of her chair like she was bracing for something. Maybe for Caleb to break, or for the inevitable fallout from the lies they had woven. But as the courtroom began to empty, a quiet figure stood by the back door. Frank, the neighbor who had quietly watched over Eleanor's property for years, now had something more than a friendly eye to offer. Frank had been busy, working behind the scenes, gathering evidence that could unravel Caleb's plans once and for all. Eleanor hadn't seen Frank slip out, but when she caught his gaze across the courtroom, she knew. He had something. Something that would tilt the balance in their favor. Frank had been watching Caleb more closely than anyone realized, and it wasn't just for personal curiosity. Frank knew something wasn't right. He had seen Caleb meet with an investor, a man who had arrived in town under the radar, quietly sliding into the back rooms of local businesses, making promises of quick sales and easy money. Caleb's quiet meetings hadn't gone unnoticed, and Frank had done more than just observe. He'd recorded the entire conversation. The recording was damning. Caleb had been on the phone with the investor, discussing a sale of the property, Eleanor's property, without her consent, without any legal backing. The plan was clear. Sell the house under the guise of a legitimate transfer of ownership. A deal that would line Caleb's pockets and leave Eleanor with nothing. The next morning, when Frank slipped into the courtroom with the recording, Eleanor's pulse quickened. Clara took it from him quickly, her eyes scanning the file. Her gaze sharpened as she played the audio, her voice barely a whisper to Eleanor. "It's all here," Clara said. Proof of Caleb's criminal intent. The courtroom went dead silent as the recording began to play. Caleb's voice filled the space, the words unmistakable and sharp. "Make sure the documents are ready. We need to sell it fast. No one can know. Eleanor won't even notice, and by the time anyone does, the money will be in my account." A murmur rippled through the room. Caleb's face paled as the realization of what had just been exposed hit him, but he didn't move. He didn't dare. He was trapped now. Clara stood and faced the judge, her posture straight, her voice calm but heavy with the weight of the evidence. "Your Honor, this recording shows Caleb Turner attempting to sell this property without authorization, in direct violation of the law. This is proof of his intent to defraud and manipulate. This is not a family dispute. It is a calculated, illegal action. The judge's eyes locked on Caleb, his face tight with fury. Mr. Turner, you are now on the verge of facing more serious charges. Attempting to sell a property under fraudulent pretenses is a criminal offense. This is contempt of court. The air in the courtroom had shifted. What had begun as a civil case, a family dispute over inheritance, was now a criminal matter. Caleb had pushed too far. He had underestimated the power of truth. Marla's face had gone completely white. She sat still, her hands shaking, unable to deny the evidence. She glanced at Caleb, her eyes pleading. This wasn't the way she had imagined this going. Not like this. She had believed in Caleb, in his plans, but the walls were closing in. Clara turned to face the judge again. We request an immediate investigation into Caleb Turner's financial dealings and the investor in question. If they are involved in laundering money through illegal sales, the full extent of their actions must be uncovered. The judge nodded, his voice cutting through the room. I will order a full investigation. Mr. Turner, you have crossed a line. The consequences for these actions will be severe. Caleb's breath quickened, his fingers twitching in his lap. His carefully constructed world was crumbling. For the first time, he seemed unsure of himself, unsure of the battle he had been so certain he could win. The smug confidence was gone, replaced by a flicker of panic. I didn't mean it. This is all a mistake, Caleb muttered, his voice breaking. You don't understand. It was just business. The judge's response was swift, his tone unforgiving. The law doesn't care about your intentions, Mr. Turner. Your actions speak for themselves, Marla. Desperate now, reached out for Caleb's hand, but he didn't acknowledge her. His eyes were locked on the judge, then on the door. He knew this was only the beginning of what was to come. Eleanor remained seated, silent and composed. She didn't need to say a word. The evidence was clear. The truth had been laid bare. Caleb's web of lies and deceit had unraveled, and now his empire of manipulation was collapsing around him. As the judge called for a recess, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, a sense of quiet satisfaction washing over her. Caleb had underestimated her. He had underestimated them all. But this wasn't over. Not yet. And the next twist, the next revelation was already waiting to be uncovered. The courtroom was heavy with anticipation as Caleb stood, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had lost so much already. The forged deed exposed, the criminal intent revealed. But he wasn't done. Not yet. This isn't over, he muttered under his breath, but the words were meant for himself as much as anyone else. His fight was far from finished. Caleb had one last weapon left, a counterclaim. With his attorney beside him, Caleb stood tall as he approached the judge, his eyes scanning the room with the same smugness he had worn throughout the trial. He was the architect of his own destruction, but now he was trying to salvage what little he could. I'm filing a countersuit, Caleb said, his voice cold and defiant. I'm requesting that Eleanor's ownership of the property be voided. The deed is invalid. She doesn't deserve it. A murmur of surprise rippled through the courtroom. Eleanor's gaze snapped to Caleb, her stomach lurching. He couldn't be serious. Not after everything he'd done. Clara immediately stood, her face pale but firm. Your Honor, she began, her voice calm but sharp. This countersuit is nothing but a desperate attempt to reverse the truth. The original deed, the one that names Eleanor as the sole owner, has already been presented to the court. She turned toward the judge, laying the original deed from the strongbox on the table. The paper was worn but clearly legitimate, its age giving it an undeniable weight. The room went still as the judge took it in his hands, inspecting the document with a practiced eye. Eleanor held her breath as he ran his fingers along the edges of the old paper, his brow furrowing slightly as he examined the signatures, the seals, and the authenticity. The judge nodded after a moment, his voice steady and unwavering. This deed is genuine, he said. It was signed by Eleanor's late husband and is legally binding. Mr. Turner's counterclaim is without merit. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. The truth was final. Caleb had no leg left to stand on. The room seemed to breathe again as the judge slammed the gavel down, declaring the case dismissed. Caleb's smirk disappeared, his shoulders slumping slightly as the weight of defeat pressed down on him. But even in that moment of loss, he couldn't help himself. His voice, laced with venom, cut through the silence. "You'll regret this, Grandma," Caleb sneered, his eyes locking with Eleanor's. "You won this battle, but the war isn't over." Not by a long shot. Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't need to say a word. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. He had lost. The game was over for him. The law had spoken, and Caleb was out of options. But Marla, her face twisted in fury, pushed past her son, her eyes blazing with rage. She stormed into the hallway, muttering curses. Under her breath, Eleanor could hear the venom in Marla's voice even as she tried to regain some composure. "You think you've won, don't you?" Marla hissed as she passed Eleanor, her words sharp as a knife. "You think this is over? You're nothing without us. This isn't the end, Eleanor." "You'll see." Eleanor stood frozen, the words hanging in the air like smoke. Marla's rage was palpable, but Eleanor knew. This was just the last desperate attempt of a woman who had been complicit in her son's actions. Marla's anger wasn't for Caleb's failure, it was for her own. The truth had cracked open the lie she had lived in for so long. Lydia's hand rested gently on Eleanor's arm, offering quiet support as they turned toward the door. The weight of the courtroom had lifted, but outside, the world was still uncertain. There was no turning back now. Not for Caleb, not for Marla. Not for any of them. Lydia wiped away a tear, her voice barely a whisper. "Grandpa wanted you safe," she said, her eyes filled with the hurt and confusion of everything they had been through. "He wanted you to have this, to protect you." Eleanor smiled softly at her granddaughter, her heart swelling with love and pride. "I know, sweetheart," she said, her voice filled with quiet resolve, "and now we can honor that." As they stepped outside, the bright daylight almost seemed like a new chapter. The fight wasn't over, but the worst of it had passed. Eleanor had faced the darkness and come out on the other side. But Caleb and Marla weren't finished. They never would be. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The courtroom was heavy with tension as Caleb walked in, his eyes narrow slits of rage and determination. He had lost everything: the house, the deed, the legitimacy of his claims. But he wasn't going down without a fight. His mind was still spinning with ideas, new strategies. He had one more card to play. Caleb's lips curled into a sneer as he looked over at Lydia. She was seated beside Eleanor, her face pale but resolute. She was the one he would use, the one he would crush if he could. He didn't care anymore about family, about decency. This was war. "I'll ruin you both," Caleb hissed, his words just low enough that only Lydia could hear. "You think this is over? You think you've won? I'll smear your name, Lydia. I'll make sure you never see another dime. Your reputation will be destroyed. I'll make sure of it." Lydia's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't flinch. She had already been prepared for Caleb's cruelty. The last thing he had left to threaten was her reputation, the thing she held most dear. But this time, he had underestimated her. Lydia's hand slid into her bag, pulling out her phone with a swift motion. Her fingers flew across the screen, tapping and swiping with a calmness that surprised even herself. She glanced up at Caleb, meeting his eyes with a steady gaze that said everything she needed to say. He would no longer be in control. With a few taps, Lydia turned the phone around and placed it on the table for everyone to see. The room went silent, the air thick with anticipation. The screen displayed a series of text messages, messages Caleb had sent her. His threats, his coercion. "You're going to regret this, Lydia. I'll make sure everyone knows what you really are. You'll never work again. No one will ever trust you. Your whole life will fall apart if you don't do what I say." The courtroom gasped in unison, the weight of Caleb's words settling over the room like a suffocating cloud. Marla's face went ashen, her hands trembling as she shot a quick, angry glance at her son. Caleb's bravado had evaporated. His eyes darted around the room, but there was nowhere to hide. He had been caught, and everyone knew it. Clara rose, her voice firm, a quiet storm building with every word. Your Honor, this is blackmail. My client has been subjected to threats of public defamation, to pressure in order to control her and her family. This is an act of elder abuse, and we intend to press charges. The judge, his face hardening with disgust, turned his gaze on Caleb, his voice low and dangerous. Mr. Turner, you have crossed a line. This is not just a matter of inheritance. You are now facing serious charges: blackmail, elder abuse, and defamation. I will not tolerate these actions in my court. Caleb's face turned red with rage, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His plan to turn the tables had failed, and now he was exposed for the world to see. He didn't know what to do next. Then, as if the floor beneath him wasn't already crumbling, the judge turned to Clara, his voice ringing out with finality. We will also be launching an investigation into Mr. Turner's financial activities. There have been allegations of money laundering through a fake construction business, and it seems the investigation is warranted. Lydia's eyes widened as the judge's words hit her like a hammer. She had known Caleb had made questionable decisions, but this was bigger than they had imagined. She looked at Eleanor, whose face was a mask of quiet resolve. For all the pain Caleb had caused, for all the chaos he had unleashed, they were winning. Caleb, on the other hand, was losing control completely. His mouth opened, but only a strangled scream escaped as his face twisted in fury. You don't understand. You're all against me. He stood up suddenly, slamming his fists against the table, the sound reverberating through the room. I didn't do anything wrong. You've all been lying. It's all a setup. The judge's gavel came down with authority, silencing Caleb's outburst. Mr. Turner, the judge said sharply, his voice stern, you will be held in contempt of court for your outburst. I have had enough. This case is now closed for the day, and a full investigation will be launched into your activities. Caleb's rage was palpable, his body shaking with fury, but the room had already turned away from him. The evidence had been presented. The truth had been laid bare, and the consequences of his actions were catching up with him faster than he could comprehend. As Caleb was led from the courtroom, muttering threats under his breath, Lydia turned to Eleanor, her hands shaking. Grandma, she whispered, her voice cracking. What if we find out something even worse? Eleanor placed a hand on her granddaughter's shoulder, squeezing gently. We'll face it together, sweetheart, she said, her voice steady and full of the quiet strength she had carried throughout this battle. The truth always has a way of coming out, and when it does, we'll be ready. The courtroom emptied, but Eleanor knew this was just another step towards something bigger. Caleb's world was unraveling, and soon it would all come crashing down. But for now, the victory was theirs. The courthouse doors had barely swung closed behind them before Eleanor could feel the storm gathering. Caleb was finally being held accountable, but the real weight of what had happened, of what was still to come, hung in the air like a fog. The world had turned on its axis, and now the consequences of Caleb's actions would unfold with the speed of a wrecking ball. Lydia walked beside her, her hand brushing against Eleanor's as if they were tethered by something stronger than blood. The echoes of the courtroom still lingered, the gavel's final strike still vibrating in their bones. Days passed in a blur of meetings with lawyers and the quiet dread of waiting for the next shoe to drop. The phone calls, the messages, the whispers in the hallways. Then, the call came. Clara's voice on the other end was calm, but Eleanor could hear the weight of the news behind it. Eleanor, Clara said softly, Caleb's been indicted for fraud. The prosecutors have officially charged him. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, taking in the news. It was almost impossible to process, the feeling of triumph tinged with a bitter sorrow. Caleb had gone too far, crossed too many lines. He had played with fire, and now it had consumed him. Lydia, who had been pacing near the window, turned toward her, her eyes wide with a mix of disbelief and relief. Is it really happening? Is he finally going to pay for what he's done? Eleanor simply nodded, her throat tight. It was happening. Caleb's empire of lies was crumbling beneath him, and the consequences were spreading like wildfire. The indictments were only the beginning. Caleb's bank accounts had been frozen, his assets seized. His fake construction business, the one that had served as a front for money laundering, was now under full investigation. The things he thought he could get away with were now laid bare for all to see. But the real shock came when the loan sharks, the very people Caleb had used to further his schemes, turned against him. The tide had turned completely. They had no loyalty to Caleb. They were in it for themselves. And with their support gone, Caleb's situation grew even more dire. The courtroom had been quiet as the prosecutors read out the charges. Caleb had sat there, stiff, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His face had turned a sickly shade of white as the full extent of his betrayal was revealed. His mouth opened and closed, but there were no more words, no more excuses. Marla had been there too, her face hollow, her eyes wide with horror as she listened to the list of Caleb's crimes. The life they had built was crumbling, and she was powerless to stop it. It had all happened too quickly. The fraud, the blackmail, the theft. Each revelation making the last one seem more egregious than the one before. Marla couldn't take it. She collapsed right there in the courtroom, sobbing uncontrollably as the judge's gavel struck. It was as though all the years of denial, of pretending, came crashing down in that one moment. Lydia's grip on Eleanor's arm tightened as they stood in the hallway. Marla's sobs echoed down the corridor, but Eleanor remained unmoved. There was no sympathy left in her for the woman who had stood by, complicit in everything, and turned a blind eye when Caleb's actions hurt those closest to him. Lydia whispered, her voice barely audible, "He's finished. It's over." Eleanor squeezed her granddaughter's hand. The weight of the moment didn't escape her. The fight, the sleepless nights, the endless betrayals, they had all led to this. Caleb was done. The law had caught up with him, and there would be no more hiding, no more manipulation. The truth was too powerful to be buried now. As they walked out into the blinding light of the courthouse steps, Eleanor felt a quiet sense of victory. Not just for the house, for her husband's legacy, but for herself, for the woman she had become in the face of all that had been done to her. She had stood strong. She had weathered every storm Caleb had thrown at her. And now, she was free. But even as the world around her seemed to open up with possibility, there was one nagging thought in the back of her mind. Caleb's empire was in ruins, but what did that mean for the future? What was left to rebuild? Eleanor knew one thing for certain: it was far from over. Caleb might have lost this round, but he wasn't finished yet. And neither was she. The house had been quiet for a few days now. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, a cup of tea cradled between her hands, steam rising in gentle curls. The window beside her offered a view of the yard, the oak tree standing tall and stoic. It was a peaceful scene, but the weight of the past weeks still hung over her like a shadow. Caleb's arrest had been a victory, yes, but she knew that in his mind, the war was still ongoing. She could feel the tension, the quiet before the next storm. Lydia was in the other room, sorting through papers, but Eleanor knew her granddaughter was just as on edge as she was. They had come through the worst, but there was still a lingering uncertainty, an unease that neither of them could shake. Caleb was out on bail, and Eleanor knew, deep down, that he wouldn't stay away for long. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. It was just after dusk when Frank called. "Eleanor," Frank's voice crackled through the phone. "You need to listen to me. I saw Caleb. He's on your property. He's sneaking around the back." Eleanor's grip tightened on the cup, the warm ceramic now feeling too hot against her skin. "What?" she asked, her voice steady despite the sudden rush of panic in her chest. "I'm calling the police. Frank continued, his tone urgent. But you need to stay inside. He's up to something. Her pulse quickened, and she rose from the table, moving toward the window to peer out into the yard. The night was falling fast, the house casting long shadows over the lawn. She couldn't see Caleb, but she didn't need to. She knew him too well. He was here, somewhere, trying to reclaim what he believed was his. Within minutes, the sound of sirens cut through the quiet, growing louder as they neared the house. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't feel the fear that she once would have. She was no longer the woman who had been taken by surprise. She had faced Caleb's worst, and now, she stood tall. Through the window, she saw two police officers stepping onto her front porch. Then, Caleb emerged from the shadows, trying to sneak around the side of the house, his head down, his movements quick but deliberate. Frank's voice echoed in her mind as the officers moved toward him. He's been warned. Don't let him do this to you again. Caleb must have sensed the officers closing in on him because he froze, his eyes wide with panic, his breath quickening. But it was too late. The officers reached him before he could make another move, pulling his arms behind his back with practiced ease, their grip firm and unforgiving. Caleb Turner, one of the officers called out, his voice cold. You're under arrest for trespassing. Again, Eleanor didn't rush to the door. She didn't run outside to confront him. She didn't need to. Instead, she slowly sipped her tea, her movements calm, deliberate, as if this was just another part of her day. She had already faced his worst. This was nothing more than the final desperate gasp of a man who had lost everything. The officers dragged Caleb toward their squad car, his feet dragging along the gravel. His face was a mask of fury and disbelief as he struggled against their hold, but it was clear to everyone watching. Caleb had lost. His fight was over. Marla was nowhere to be seen. Eleanor had expected her to show up, angry, defending her son, but the absence was telling. The woman who had once stood by Caleb, blind to his cruelty, was now hiding in shame. Perhaps she too was finally realizing the truth. Caleb wasn't the man they thought he was. The reality of his actions was too much to bear. Lydia appeared beside Eleanor, her arms crossed, her eyes dark with both exhaustion and relief. She watched as Caleb was shoved into the back of the police car, his eyes flashing with a rage that made him look like a cornered animal. He had lost, and yet there was no apology in his eyes, no remorse. He can't hurt us again, Grandma, Lydia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Eleanor didn't answer at first. She simply set her cup down on the windowsill, her fingers resting lightly against the edge. She could feel the weight of everything, her past, her fears, the years she had spent trying to protect her family from Caleb's manipulation. But now, in this moment, she also felt the quiet strength of a woman who had fought back and won. No, sweetheart, Eleanor said finally, her voice steady. He can't. As the police car pulled away, the house felt quieter than it had in weeks. The yard, the oak tree, the space they had fought so hard to protect. All of it stood as a reminder that their fight had been worth it. Caleb had tried to take everything from them, but in the end, he had nothing left. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt the weight of the past lift from her shoulders. But even as the night settled around them, she knew Caleb's next move was already brewing. His fight wasn't over. Not yet. But neither was hers. The war was far from over. The morning light streamed softly through the curtains, casting long shadows across the room. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, a new sheet of paper before her, the pen in her hand steady, but the weight of her decision heavy. It was time. She had fought for her life, for her family, and now it was time to ensure that legacy was protected. The house was still, save for the gentle hum of the old refrigerator and the distant rustling of leaves outside. She could hear Lydia in the other room, moving around, the sound of her footsteps familiar and comforting. After everything, Eleanor felt that this small act, writing the will, was finally her choice, her future in her own hands. Her eyes drifted to the oak tree outside. Her husband's memory still lingered there, beneath the roots and branches. He had planted that tree long before the storm had come, long before Caleb had attempted to tear apart their lives. The tree was still standing, just as she was. The new will was simple, clear, the language firm. Caleb and Marla, once heirs, once part of this family, were gone from her future. She had fought for what was rightfully hers, and now she was ensuring that the past could never repeat itself. She carefully signed her name at the bottom of the page, the words feeling like a promise to herself, to her husband, and most of all, to Lydia. She slid the pen to the side, her hand trembling only slightly. The weight of disinheriting her son and his wife should have been heavier, but there was no room left for guilt. There was only clarity. Caleb's actions had removed any shred of family, any connection they had once shared. Lydia walked in, her eyes wide with curiosity, but she didn't ask. She saw the paper. She understood. She had watched as her grandmother carried the burden of Caleb's betrayal. She had seen the strength in Eleanor, the quiet resilience that had allowed her to stand tall through every attempt to tear her down. Lydia stood beside her, her gaze softening as she looked at the will, her hand resting gently on Eleanor's shoulder. "Are you sure, Grandma?" she asked, her voice tender but firm. Eleanor nodded, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "It's the right thing to do," she said, her voice steady. "It's time to move on, sweetheart. Caleb and Marla had their chance, and they threw it away. This is for you now. Everything I have, everything your grandfather and I worked for. It's yours." Lydia's breath hitched. Her chest tightened as the weight of the moment settled in. For so long, she had been the one watching from the sidelines, the one trying to protect Eleanor. But now, she was being entrusted with the future. The future her grandmother had spent years building, years protecting. "I don't know what to say," Lydia whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I never thought I'd have to carry this, but I'll honor it, Grandma. I'll make sure you're safe. You'll always be safe." Eleanor's eyes welled with unshed tears, but she held them back. "You're not carrying this alone, Lydia. We'll do it together. But you need to know, you're my legacy now. And I trust you." Clara entered the room then, carrying the final piece of the puzzle, her trusted legal pad and the notarization form. Eleanor's hand shook slightly as Clara took the papers, glanced them over, and placed her stamp of approval. The trust was now legally airtight. Clara smiled softly, her voice firm yet kind. "It's done. This will stand. And with it, Lydia's inheritance is protected. There's no more room for Caleb to try and manipulate you. You've done the right thing." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of Clara's words wash over her. The victory was now tangible, the promise of peace secured. The storm had passed. But this was her final act of defiance. Caleb had wanted to destroy everything. He hadn't succeeded. She sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly, the quiet of the room wrapping around her like a blanket. "Thank you, Clara," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet satisfaction. "For everything." Lydia was still standing beside her, her hand still resting on Eleanor's shoulder. The quiet strength in her touch reminded Eleanor that, though the road had been long and filled with pain, they were together now. And together, they could face whatever came next. Eleanor's mind drifted to the future, to the life Lydia would lead. She had always hoped that Lydia would never have to carry the burden of Caleb's sins. But she was ready. She was strong enough. And she would protect the legacy of the family, just as Eleanor had done. Lydia leaned in, her voice barely a whisper. "He won't hurt us again, Grandma. We're safe now." Eleanor didn't say anything at first. She simply held Lydia close, feeling the weight of the words settle between them. She had fought for her family, for Lydia, and now they could finally move forward. The house, once filled with chaos, now felt like a home again. The oak tree outside stood tall, its branches swaying in the breeze, an enduring symbol of strength and resilience. And in that moment, Eleanor knew that no matter what came next, She would always have Lydia by her side. They would rebuild. Together. It was over. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue across the quiet street as Eleanor sat on her front porch, a gentle breeze stirring the air. The house, for the first time in years, felt still. Calm. For all the storms that had raged within these walls, the quiet peace that now enveloped them seemed like a distant dream. It was a victory, but one that tasted bittersweet. The echoes of Caleb's cruelty still lingered, but the future was beginning to feel a little more like her own again. Lydia was inside, going through some old family photos, but Eleanor knew that the real weight of their victory had yet to fully settle. Caleb wasn't gone for good. She could feel the tension, the threat of something hanging in the air. She was right. The sharp sound of tires on gravel broke the stillness. Eleanor's eyes shifted toward the driveway, narrowing instinctively. There, standing in the middle of the road, was Caleb. His face red, eyes wild. His clothes were rumpled, his hair a mess. But it wasn't just the disarray that caught her attention. It was the look in his eyes. Panic. Desperation. "Grandma!" Caleb's voice cracked, raw and shaky as he stumbled toward her. "Please. I didn't mean to. I was desperate. You've got to understand, I never thought it would come to this." Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't stand up. She remained seated, her posture unwavering as she met his gaze. Cold, deliberate. The years of pain he had caused, the lies he had fed her, the deceit that had shredded their family, all of it ran through her mind in that moment. She didn't need to hear his excuses. "Forgiveness is free," Eleanor said, her voice calm but hard. "Inheritance is not." Caleb took a step forward, his hand trembling as if he could reach for the last shred of hope he thought he still had. His voice wavered as he continued to beg. "I was desperate, Grandma. I didn't know what else to do. I thought I could fix it. You don't understand. I did it for us. For the family. You were supposed to help me. I couldn't do this alone." Behind him, Eleanor saw the faint shadows of their neighbors peeking from behind the curtains of their homes. It was as though the entire block was watching. The people who had once turned a blind eye to Caleb's behavior, the ones who hadn't known what to believe, now stood witness to the unraveling of everything Caleb had built. And Lydia was standing inside, her phone pointed toward the front yard, quietly recording the encounter. She hadn't said a word, but Eleanor could feel her daughter's quiet support through the glass. Caleb's words would be documented, proof of his manipulation, of his selfishness. The truth, once again, would be laid bare for all to see. Caleb's voice broke, his eyes shining with tears, but there was no longer any pity in Eleanor's heart. She had seen enough. "You're wrong, Caleb," she said, her voice carrying with a quiet finality. "You thought you could tear us apart, but you've only destroyed yourself. It's over." Suddenly, the sharp whine of sirens cut through the air, and a pair of deputies pulled up to the curb. The officers stepped out, their faces unreadable as they approached Caleb, their hands ready at their sides. Caleb didn't move. He didn't fight. He was too far gone now. He simply dropped his head, shoulders slumping in defeat. "Caleb Turner," one of the deputies said, his voice stern. "You're under arrest for trespassing and for violating the terms of your bail." There was no struggle. Caleb's hands were cuffed with mechanical precision as the deputies led him toward the patrol car. His head hung low, the rage that had once been in his eyes now replaced by something deeper, a hollow recognition that he was, at last, facing the consequences of his actions. As the police car pulled away, Eleanor didn't rise from the porch. She stayed seated, a sense of finality washing over her. The battle was over, and with it, Caleb's hold over her life. From across the street, Lydia stepped out onto the porch, her phone still recording. She looked at her grandmother, her face a mix of exhaustion and relief, her breath catching in her chest. "He can't hurt us again, Grandma," she whispered, the weight of the words finally sinking in. Eleanor's lips twitched into a smile, though there was no joy in it. Only the hard-earned peace of knowing that the fight had been won. No, sweetheart. He can't. Behind them, Marla's absence spoke volumes. Eleanor had expected her to be there, furious, defending Caleb. But she hadn't come. In the wake of the destruction, Marla had vanished, a coward in the face of truth. Eleanor wasn't surprised. The woman who had stood by Caleb's side, blind to his cruelty, had finally understood. She had seen the truth of what had happened and couldn't bear the weight of it. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the oak tree once more. The sun had set now, and the sky was a canvas of soft purples and blues. She had spent so many years protecting the legacy of her family, fighting to keep the past intact. Now, she was ready to look forward. But as the evening air wrapped around her like a comforting embrace, Eleanor made one more decision. One that would solidify her family's legacy, not in wealth, but in purpose. The next day, Eleanor made the call. She would donate part of her estate to fund a community garden, a place of growth and healing, and a scholarship in her husband's name, a place where future generations could thrive, free of the shadows that had tried to darken their path. She had fought for what was hers, but now it was time to give back, to honor the love and memory that had never faltered, even in the darkest of times. And as Lydia joined her on the porch, their quiet strength standing side by side, Eleanor knew that this was how they would rebuild. Together. The sun rose higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the yard. The quiet that had settled over the house in the wake of Caleb's arrest felt different now. Lighter. The weight of years of manipulation and deceit had been lifted, replaced with a new sense of purpose, a new beginning. Eleanor stood at the edge of the yard, looking out over the old oak tree that had stood as a symbol of strength and resilience throughout the turmoil. The roots of that tree had grown deep, and now, beneath its branches, something new would take root. The community garden was finally ready to be unveiled. The once overgrown corner of the yard had been transformed into a sanctuary. Lush greenery spread out in every direction, bursting with life. The garden wasn't just a tribute to the past, but to the future. To the community that had stood by, to the people who had seen the truth, and to the legacy Eleanor would leave behind, one of growth, hope, and renewal. Eleanor's fingers brushed against the freshly planted flowers, a gentle smile tugging at her lips as she breathed in the scent of the earth. She had fought for this, for peace, for something good to come from all the pain, and now it was here, blooming in front of her. Lydia stepped up beside her, her eyes scanning the garden with awe. "I think Grandpa would have loved this," she said, her voice soft but full of emotion. Eleanor nodded, her gaze shifting to the engraved plaque near the oak tree, a small but permanent reminder of the man who had planted the roots of the life they now honored. "He would have," Eleanor said quietly. "This is for him." The dedication ceremony was set to begin in just a few minutes. Neighbors had gathered, drawn by the promise of something good to come from the ashes of everything Caleb had tried to destroy. Frank, ever the quiet observer, stood nearby, watching with pride as the community filed in. Eleanor felt a moment of peace, the kind she had not known in years. The battle had been long, but it was finally over. She had won. Lydia stood up straighter, the small ceremony about to start. She held the microphone, her voice steady as she began to speak. "Today, we're here to honor my grandmother's legacy, her strength, her determination, and her refusal to let the darkness of the past control her future. This garden, this place of growth, is just one example of how she's taken the most difficult moments of her life and turned them into something beautiful. We've all witnessed her fight for what's right, and now, it's time for us to carry that forward." Eleanor's heart swelled with pride as Lydia continued, naming the scholarship fund that would benefit local students who were pursuing higher education, ensuring that the next generation had the tools to build their own futures. And, Lydia added with A smile. I am honored to be named the trustee of the fund. I promise to carry it forward, just as Grandma carried us all through the toughest of times. Frank smiled from the sidelines, his face weathered but full of warmth. He had been there for Eleanor when no one else had. He had known the truth long before it was laid bare for everyone to see. Now he stood with her, proud of the woman she had become. The press arrived just in time to capture the final moments of the ceremony. The headlines would carry stories of hope, of redemption, of a family that had triumphed in the face of destruction. Grandmother defeats fraud, builds future. One headline would read. The story would be told in glowing terms, the narrative finally shifting from scandal to success, from destruction to growth. The morning passed in a blur of handshakes, smiles, and promises for the future. But amidst the noise, Eleanor found herself standing still for a moment, her eyes focused on the oak tree. The garden spread out in every direction, and beneath the shade of the tree, it felt like everything had finally fallen into place. She felt a deep, overwhelming sense of peace, something she hadn't felt in years. The past would always be with her, woven into the fabric of the home she had fought so hard to protect. But now, the future was hers to shape. Caleb, his cruelty, his greed, none of it had been able to break her. She had rebuilt. She had made something good from the ashes. And as the crowd gathered around, clapping and celebrating, Eleanor turned to Lydia, her heart full. The legacy was in good hands. Their future was bright. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt the weight of the past fall away completely. She could finally breathe again. The future, with all its promises, was waiting. The sun had dipped low behind the trees, casting a soft golden light that bathed the yard in a quiet, serene glow. The oak tree stood like a sentinel, its branches reaching out across the yard, now bordered by lush greenery. Eleanor walked slowly along the garden's edge, Lydia by her side, the air cool and calm in the fading light. The garden was thriving. Bright flowers bloomed where the ground had once been barren, where Caleb's dark ambitions had tried to take root. It was a stark contrast to the past. The soil once disturbed by secrets and lies was now alive with growth. And it felt, in some strange way, like a victory not just for Eleanor, but for the legacy her family had worked so hard to preserve. Lydia's hand brushed against her grandmother's arm, the weight of their shared history between them. The past few months had been a whirlwind, but now, with the garden growing before them, it all felt real. Eleanor's heart swelled with pride, and the tension that had gripped her for so long seemed to fade with each step. Caleb's presence in their lives, his cruelty, his manipulation, had been buried along with the dirt in the yard. He dug to bury me, Eleanor said softly, almost to herself, the words hanging in the evening air. I dug to free us. Lydia paused, her gaze shifting from the garden to her grandmother, her expression full of understanding. You didn't just give me an inheritance, Grandma, she said, her voice steady but full of emotion. You gave me strength. You gave me something I can carry with me, something no one can take away. Eleanor smiled, her heart heavy but at peace. She had fought so hard for this moment, for the future that now lay open before them. She had given everything to protect her family, to safeguard what was truly valuable. And now, in the quiet of the evening, it felt like all of the struggles had been worth it. They continued their walk, the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath their feet a quiet backdrop to their thoughts. There were no more sounds of scraping shovels, no more frantic digging in the dark of night. It was as though the earth itself had reclaimed its peace. Back at the house, Frank was already setting the table for dinner, the soft glow of candlelight spilling from the window. The kitchen smelled of something savory, filling the house with warmth. The two of them, Lydia and Eleanor, returned to the comfort of the home they had worked so hard to protect. Frank greeted them with a smile, his face a little more relaxed, the lines of worry that had been etched there for so long softening. The three of them sat down together at the table, the quiet hum of life around them. It was a peaceful silence, the kind that came after a long, hard battle when the heart finally had a chance to rest. No more threats, no more fear. Just the sound of laughter from Lydia as she recounted the day's events, the glow of the candles flickering between them, and the warmth of a meal shared. Eleanor looked around the table, the weight of her choices settling in her bones. She had built something new, something that would last far beyond the destruction that Caleb had tried to bring. And now, in this moment of calm, with Lydia and Frank by her side, she knew that they had all made it through, together. The last traces of the sun disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the yard bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. The garden that had once been a place of secrecy and manipulation was now a sanctuary, a living, breathing testament to survival. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt that the chapter of Caleb's shadow had closed. They were free. "Do you know what I realized, Grandma?" Lydia's voice broke through her thoughts, gentle but filled with something profound. Eleanor turned to her granddaughter, her eyes soft with affection. "What's that, sweetheart?" Lydia smiled, her gaze turning toward the window, the faint light of the garden visible through the glass. "He dug for fortune in your soil, Grandma, but you buried him in the truth, and grew a legacy instead." Eleanor's breath caught, the finality of Lydia's words settling deep within her. It was true. Caleb had tried to dig up everything they had built, but Eleanor had not only buried his lies, she had planted something better in its place. The future, their future, was now their own to shape. As the wind rustled through the trees carrying the soft sounds of the night, Eleanor leaned back in her chair, content. She could finally rest. They had built something beautiful, something no one could take away. The past was done, and the future was just beginning.